Welcome to the Salience podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
In this episode, we will be discussing culture and change management. I would like to welcome David Lee to this episode of the Salience podcast. David is a global change and business transformation executive and advisor with over 25 years of experience in leading change in organizations ranging from startups to Fortune 500 to the public sector. David is engaged in organizational change as an executive sponsor, advisor, and instructor for a wide range of organizations, including American Express, the Development Bank of Singapore, Chanel, Techcombank, and Abowitz Equity Ventures, among others. Notably, David led the global transformation efforts for Discover the World Marketing, the largest global sales agent for the travel industry, operating across 5 continents and 60 countries at a time when the entire industry was facing both value chain and technological disruption. He is currently a managing consultant and lead trainer at Prosci Singapore, a leading provider of expertise and capacity building in change management. In this session, we will be discussing complexity in culture when going through change and the importance of experimentation in business transformation. So, David, I know a little bit about your background and it's really interesting. So, if you could tell everyone a little bit about how you became who you are.
Boy, that's a very philosophical question, isn't it? I think we ask ourselves every day. And I thought it could go on for a long time, but I think one reason to do something like this kind of interview is to reflect on who you are. And I'm not really sure I know the answer to it, but I had a really interesting experience about a month ago, and it made me think about how I became what I am and who I am. I went back to a school that I attended 38 years ago on Guam. So I was living on Guam. My dad was in the military, and his job was to chase typhoons and fly through typhoons. So that in itself lends yourself to an interesting childhood. But living on Guam twice, having lived there when I was really young and then moving back when I was in middle school. And I went back there to do some immigration stuff for my wife, who's from Russia. And I thought, I get to introduce her to Guam. I get her to see Guam. But for me, I hadn't been there in almost 40 years, which was just crazy thought. And I'm touring this school, and I'm starting to have all these memories of growing up on military bases and growing up in places that are so isolated. And then the travel from there. So we lived in Guam, but we also traveled because my dad had access to Japan and Hong Kong and Philippines and places like that when I was right at that age where things start becoming important to you. And I think that is probably the most defining thing about who I was and what I've become, because I remember going to Hong Kong when I was 14 and seeing Hong Kong and experiencing Hong Kong the way it was in the 80s, and thinking, I really want to live in a place like this and come here and experience this. And so I think that's when I set my goal, that I wanted to live and work in Asia and travel the world and be a part of really high innovative and exciting places. And so I think just taking that experience, that moment of being in this isolated island, but having those kind of memories and setting the goals to travel the world and see different places and be a part of it, I think that's probably the best answer I can give you. Is that is something I've been pursuing for the rest of my life. So it's all about experiences to me.
Wonderful. So, you mentioned you were in Hong Kong and you said, I really need to be in a place like this. Could you describe what you mean by a place like this?
Oh, it's just, I don't know I haven't been in Hong Kong since COVID, but I know it's changed, and people have talked about how it's changed. But I think in the 80s, it was probably its heyday. So it was just high energy place, lots of excitement. You always knew that there was this surface level that you're seeing as a tourist, but somehow there's some like 9 different layers that you could never fully explore. I remember one story going to my dad needed to get a coat made, so he went to a tailor in Kowloon, and he invited us out to dinner. And there was another pilot there who was also getting a suit made. He was a different kind of pilot, was a private pilot, but he and my dad were talking the whole lunch. Meanwhile, the tailor proceeds in getting me completely drunk for the first time in my life. And I guess my dad and the pilot.
How old were you?
I was 14.
Okay.
And, probably didn't take much, so, but I think my dad and the other guy were having a few of their own. I can't speak for them, but I know that the rest of the day was a bit of a blur, but ended up in the, touring a junk in Hong Kong Bay, and, just crazy experiences that you never expect when the day starts. You never know in a place like Hong Kong where your day is going to take you. And I've been back there 4 or 5 times in my life, and it similar experiences. It just kept going. You got to meet people with different cultures. So just at that lunch, there was a fellow from Australia who was flying in Saudi Arabia, who was telling great stories to my dad, who's been all over the world, with the tailor from Hong Kong and a few other people from parts of the world, and all around one table, and just great stories. And I was just fascinated by everything that was going on there. So I think that just formulated my view of what I wanted to keep doing, was have those kind of experiences. And I'm glad to say that, I've been able to see a lot of places, be around tables like that in a lot of parts of the world. And that's always been my goal. So.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
maybe you could tell us a little bit about how this also influenced your career choices, and also as you got into your career, what some key experiences were that nudged you in this direction of managing complexity, change management.
Yeah. So I think it plays a lot into it. So I can't say that I had any kind of career plan. In fact, even going to college, I was surprised when I showed up at my university and they put me in the business school, because I didn't remember checking that as my major, but I just went with it. Things like that just happened all the way along. I went to Europe on a program through Washington University, which was my university, and ended up in an internship at the European Parliament. That's not what I asked for, but that's what they had. So I ended up doing that. And that was quite an experience, and went on a trip there where they were touring all the European institutions. And I woke up one morning in I think it was a Marriott in Belgium, and CNN was on, and I was listening to the international news, and I was looking out at Brussels, and I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to travel the world and have other people pay for it. So that started formulating my mindset. And then I found a guy who was applying to this crazy school in Arizona called Thunderbird, which he describes as a bunch of tin shacks out in the desert where they teach languages. And for my weird sensibilities, that appealed to me. So I set a goal then of going to Thunderbird, but I didn't get there for a while. So I ended up moving and participating in politics. And then I was a construction project manager. And then finally I thought, I'm going to go to Thunderbird. So I went to Thunderbird, and it's this wonderful international management school with a mindset exactly like I was talking about, sitting around the table with people from different parts of the world, different cultures, learning about business, learning about how to do business in different parts of the world. It's now owned by Arizona State University, but back then it was independent. Got my master's there, went into the travel industry, and that's where I got my first change experience, because I joined a company called Sabre. And again, nothing planned. They were just the only ones to offer me a job. So, but the travel industry was something that appealed to me because my mom was a travel agent. And of course, I love travel. Sabre is the core backbone technology of the travel industry. So anybody who's booked online or gone to a travel agent or watched people at the airlines type incessantly in their computers has experienced Sabre. But I was assigned to this back-end strategic product of theirs that was supposed to be helping them keep clients, but was in fact doing just the opposite. It was really making clients angry and threatening to leave. And there needed to be a change. And I suggested that there'd be a change, or I wanted to transfer out. So I ended up in charge of the change. So that was my first experience. And I think you and I have talked about this story, and we had approached it from sort of what would be now a Lean Six Sigma point of view of continuous improvement, but it wasn't really making a difference. And so one day I was watching the movie Jurassic Park, and the movie really has nothing to do with it. It reminded me of what I had read in that book. And in that book, and there's a character called Ian Malcolm who's all about chaos theory. And it got me thinking about the fact that maybe we were approaching this incorrectly, and that we needed to think about all the variables out there being too much for us to handle in terms of trying to find the exact change that worked for everybody. And it's one of those situations where I think you read something or you think about something, you go to sleep, and then your brain's working it through. And I woke up the next morning with the idea that we needed to go out and create islands for different levels of clients, because we were treating everybody the same in a hugely complex situation. And so we did that. So we went and created 4 different approaches, applying the same process, but applying it in different ways for different client groups. And that seemed to make all the difference. So each group went off and developed their own way of applying that process. And they came back with completely different approaches for different client sets. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the fact is that it actually works. And it was only then that I started talking to a consultant about it and found out that there was this idea of applying chaos theory, or it was evolving into the idea of complexity. So there's chaos theory, and then complexity is the way to manage in chaotic environment. And so he gave me a book on it, and I said, okay, this isn't original thoughts. There's other people out there who are doing this. So I started reading up on it and understanding it, and then in future job experiences had the opportunity to apply it with similar results where other things didn't work. They didn't drive actual change. Applying the approaches that this gives you that are different actually did manage to move the dial. Another example, so later on I was working for American Express, and I was in charge of implementing a innovation methodology, a new product development methodology. But in the past, it had always been centralized. We're going to have one group do this. And this wasn't working very well because people would go around that group and do their own thing. So what we finally do is take that thinking and put it on its head, which is, instead of having one group doing innovation and new product development, actually teaching others to do it. So that was the same idea. So by doing that, we managed to get that process going and get people to share ideas and be transparent about it. And so the change started to work. And that took a while to implement, but it actually started to work. Then later on, I got into a small organization that you mentioned that was highly complex. It's called Discover the World. Unless you're in the travel industry, you wouldn't have heard of this group, but their job is to be the outsourcing sales and marketing agents for travel suppliers in different parts of the world, that where they don't want to invest full time into that market because they don't fly there or they don't have an interest there, but they want to draw business from it. Well, this group was very interesting because they're spread out over 60 countries. Each of the countries has their own owner that is licensed into this group. And then they have, at that time, I think they had 80 to 100 different clients that could have a different mix in different markets. So every market's completely different in terms of their mix of clients and their deals with clients and then their owner. And they had to go through major changes to keep their business viable as the environment changed. And there's where I really saw this being important approach, because this is a small company. It's only, at the time, 500 people, but as complex as anything I've ever seen. And the idea that you would try and centrally control everything that was happening there was only creating crises and only creating more problems and more challenges. So we had to think differently about allowing people to work locally and then make their own changes locally, and then say what works in that market may work in other markets, may not. So let's expand out from there. And that's how we started to drive the change there. So I became very interested in this topic and finally joined a consulting firm leading their change management practice, where two things happened. One, I got to take a deep dive on this type of stuff. And two, I got to be introduced to the Prosci methodology for change management, which are seemingly contrary points of view. But I was able to come to how they can work together in my mind, and I pursued Prosci. There again, I just kind of fell into it because when you're a consulting firm, you can be on the bench and you're not working on something. You want to find something to do. So they asked who wanted to become a Prosci instructor because that was the methodology they were applying. And I raised my hand because I wanted to be busy. So I ended up taking the Prosci programs to become an instructor and then helping turn that into part of what we did at the consulting firm. So my job was to train our consultants, but we were also in a situation where we could train our clients. So I learned Prosci. And eventually I wanted to get back here to Singapore and into Asia. And I was talking to the fellow who ran the market here and asked him if there were any change management roles that he knew about in Singapore. And he said no, but I could use somebody to come run the market for me. So again, I fell into it. Just good timing, serendipity, and I've been here since 2020, February of 2020. When I arrived, I had a bit of a cough, and one of our guys who works with us, one of my colleagues, says that I was probably the person who brought COVID to Singapore. Not sure that's true. It wasn't that bad a cough, but we were locked down here for 2 years after that, so not much ability to travel or anything. But since I had lived here before in another role in American Express, I had experienced Southeast Asia, so I was patient and got to know Singapore more in those 2 years because the first round of living here, I didn't get to know Singapore. I was traveling to other places, but since we were here, we had to get to know Singapore, and it's really made a difference in understanding life here and what it's all about. And I'm actually sort of grateful for the period when the circuit breaker was in effect, and we had to stay here and get to know the local environment. So, yeah.
So that's incredible, David. As I was listening to you talk both about your personal life, how it is that you didn't ever really make plans in the most formal way, but you had an idea, a direction of where it is you wanted to go, and you were open to things sort of emerging. And that brings to mind, the thinking around change management being in sort of two different schools, right? There is the school of plan change, which, organizations love. They love to be able to budget, to plan, to roll things out in sort of solid phases. And then there is the reality of emergent change when things hit the ground. And I feel like I see the trend play out both in your personal life, your professional career, as well as, in the projects that you've been running. So it's pretty incredible, really.
Well, I like you think of that. Until you sent me this idea, I didn't really think of it that way, but I think there are parallels. So what's interesting about complexity thinking, and you and I have talked about this, but I think what's interesting about it is, to me, it's more of a validation of the way that I just thought naturally. I don't think people think in the same way, but I've always had this idea to let things emerge, and that things are unpredictable. But if you account for the unpredictability, and you think of how can I set myself up to be successful when things are unpredictable, then you have the best opportunity to do that. Now, the success is always a question, whether that's actually happened or not, if I'm successful, or that's still yet to be seen. But it's a bit like riding a wave or being very buoyant in the seas, that you have to move with it or you're not going to be able to survive. So that, I think that's the way I think naturally growing up as a military kid. But it works for me also in the business world when I'm applying it. But again, not everybody thinks this way. Some people want structure. And I think that's where something like Prosci comes in, which it provides that baseline structure that allows you to think about that allows you to put in place and handle, say, 60 to 80% of what's going to happen during any given change, and then allows you to freeze your mind up so that you can work with the other 20 to 40% and be creative and account for that buoyancy. So there's some level where the structure helps, and then there's some level where it helps to be quite buoyant.
I kind of want to pick up on that point because you said that it's something that came quite naturally to you as a military kid. I want to dig a little deeper there. Like, if you were to think about how you think, how you respond to things, your quote unquote planning or lack thereof, what do you think it is about some qualities that you possess and that you've seen in others who maybe take a similar approach or philosophy to life that makes you more likely to be comfortable with uncertainty?
Oh, that's a good question. And actually, I think if I had to look at the relationships in my life, I think this is a problem as much as a solution. Because like you said, I will set a goal in the future and kind of have a vision of there, but I'm not going to dictate how I get there. And so I'll let things flow, but always be moving towards that goal. But I'll let things flow otherwise. Whereas other people who I encounter or have strong relationships with, they want a solid plan. They want the stability of knowing what's happening right now and where that's what are the steps that are going to get to that stage. So I think there are different personalities and what works for people. So on a positive front, it leaves me open to opportunities that I never would have thought of, and seeking out opportunities that otherwise I wouldn't have thought of. On the other hand, it can be very frustrating to people around you. And I think that applies in organizations as well. So it's hard to lead this way when when the people around you want that solid plan, that stability, when that may not be the right thing to do in that situation. So one of the nice things that I've learned from you and other people is that there's different ways of working in different environments. So there's sometimes where that solid plan is absolutely necessary. If you're in a very simple environment, and then as you get to more complex or chaotic environments, you want to leave room for opportunities that come up. And so I think understanding those differences and when that works best is important to leaders. Unfortunately, I think many people think that it's the job of a leader to set the solid plan and say, this is the only way of doing it, and I can predict the future, and if I can't, then I'm a failure. And I don't believe that at all. So to me, there's a dichotomy between what works in given environment and what we're expecting our leaders to do. Does that make any sense to you?
Absolutely. So you're sort of talking about the way that we've conceived of leadership as a concept needs to change in a way to respond to increasing uncertainty.
Yeah, increasing uncertainty and complexity. I think that's actually stuff that I've learned from you and other people who are in this environment. It may not be the same in every situation, what we expect of our leaders and what is the right course to take. And yet we have the same expectation no matter the environment. You can't be a good leader or manager unless you can predict the outcome exactly the way it's going to happen, plan for every step along the way. And if that plan doesn't quite work out in exactly the way we laid it out, we deem it a failure. And I don't think that's the right way to think in every situation.
So you mentioned Prosci earlier, and I want to get you to explain what Prosci is before we move ahead, and then come back to this conversation on leadership, because I think it's important that the listeners know what Prosci means.
Yeah. Okay. So Prosci is the world leader in change management training. They're a research-based organization. They actually stand professional science is what Prosci stands for. And they're a research-based organization. They've done tons of research over a couple of decades on change management. and they developed a training program for people to manage change based on that research. And part of what I do is provide the instruction in that methodology in Singapore. And I'm now a Prosci employee. So they're a global organization. They're in, I don't know how many countries they're in, but they're in almost every continent. And they're almost ubiquitous when it comes to having an approach and a methodology for it. So some people may recognize them through the ADKAR approach, which is part of a core part of their methodology. They might hear about them. So that is understanding how people move through change, and then how can you help them remove the barriers as they move through change? How can we then measure that and monitor that and help them through that process, both at the individual level and then escalating up into the organizational level. So it's a great program. And I was introduced to it at the consulting firm because that was the methodology we ended up using at the consulting firm. But now I'm a Prosci employee and managing the Singapore market for them.
Amazing. So, you've worked across many different industries and have also spent a significant amount of time in different regions and across cultures. Have you spotted any patterns between how different people respond to change? What are some different cultural patterns you've seen?
And so I was thinking about this long and hard, and I actually think the differences that I've seen or noticed really come down to a maturity level with helping people adopt change. And I think that can reside in the culture that you're in. So say Singapore, but it also sits in the country or in the company, not the country, the company. I was actually in a conversation with somebody who's a chief change officer of a multinational just the other day. And we were trying to figure out, one of the questions she was asking was whether or not she thinks the organizational culture dominates or the culture you're in dominates. And of course, the answer is it's a mix. And what I came down to on that in my mind is that the biggest question is, how is leadership dealing with change and what's their approach to it? And that could be, again, the corporate culture or the culture they grew up in or some combination of that. How ego-driven is their approach, or how enabling is their approach? Do they actively participate in the process, or do they assign it to others and then disappear? Do they feel, do people in the environment or in that organization feel like they can voice challenges, or are they forced into compliance? Do they enable people in the organization, or do they put up barriers to make it difficult? Are they transparent in their communications, or do they have this kind of need to know approach? And one that's really hit me quite often, which is surprising to me, is do they subvert their own change that they're driving? And so those type of questions come up to me when I think of what is the culture that you're in and you're trying to drive change. Obviously, there's cultures that are more open to change and better at it, and there's ones that are more closed, and there's a whole spectrum in between. But those are the questions to me. It comes down to, how is the leadership viewing this process, and how do they participate in that? And so to me, one of the things I'll do before I'll take on a project is I'll say, do the leaders recognize their role in change? Are they going to be accountable for the change, or are they going to, again, sign that off to somebody? Are they aware of the change management process? Have they educated themselves on that? Or are they open to being educated on that and being coached on that? Do they communicate the value of whatever the change is on all levels? Or do they feel like that's only for the elite few and the rest? Are they building the right environment for change? Do they see that as their job? So instead of this kind of command and control approach where they say, this is the change, everybody has to comply with it, and are they actually saying, look, let me build an environment where people feel like they can change and that change is a good thing and they're going to be rewarded for changing, that sort of thing. Do they adjust their approach, just like we were talking about, based on the complexity of the situation? And do they focus their time on removing barriers and treat change as itself as an investment and a change or transformation of its own? So all those things are embedded in whatever the culture is. And to me, I've been in cultures in in different parts of Asia where they're very open and the leaders are very um, uh, aware of their effect on the change. And I've been in parts of the U.S. where they're very closed and driving compliance. So I don't think you find one in another, but it is about maturity level. And do they and that can occur anywhere. Does it tend to be higher maturity levels in certain markets over others? Absolutely. But I'm starting to see this trend everywhere. And to me, that's a good thing. It's nice to see this come through.
So, picking up on that, one of the trends that I've been seeing in a lot of transformation journeys across different organizations is this concept of distributing leadership across different levels, distributing decision making, distributing sense making, so that they recognize that the leader cannot command and control the whole change, and there needs to be sort of the ability to allow for change autonomy almost within a certain framework. I wanted to get your thinking on that, particularly because you actually teach this stuff, right?
Yeah, I think obviously I agree with that. So I like the word that I like the fact that you're using distributing versus decentralizing, because I think there's a bit of it's a fine line, but I think there's a difference between those terms. And um, people are really afraid of decentralizing their organization because they see a huge risk with it. But by distributing it, what I'm doing is I'm changing my role as a leader. My role is to enable the people to lead at their own levels and to allow that change, but also by distributing it, I'm allowing for experimentation in different places. And then when something works, we can share that out to the rest of the group. So I'm still, as a leader, in control of the environment in the sense that I'm building that environment, but I'm not dictating what's happening. And um, again, the more complex the situation, the more important that is. I think that can occur at any level of a company, wherever they are in their life cycle. But as you become more complicated, more complex, then it becomes more important to be leading that way. And there again is something where we need to be able to train our leaders and get it in their minds that the situation is different, and being in control is not the goal. Being able to predict the outcome is not the goal. The goal is to create an environment where this change can emerge. Again, I'm using terms again that are for the geeks, right? For those of us who spend a lot of time studying this and learning about it. So it really comes down then to how do we set up a situation where people can apply it and give them the tools they need to apply it. Prosci is one of those tools. Now, what I will say about it is having a structured approach. When I first was introduced to this, having the structured approach, I was a bit of a snob about it. And it took me a while to start to see the value in that there is a balance. So it's not a structured approach that's meant to be applied universally in exactly the same way. So in your example where you have distributed approaches, but have a similar framework that people are utilizing, I've applied that in a couple of situations and found that to be enormously successful. But it wasn't dictating you have to do it exactly this way, but here's an example. And that creates a common language, a common process, and it also makes people transferable across the organization so they can utilize it in different places. So I had to come to terms with this idea, and yeah, the more I experiment with it, the more I believe in it. And I say in our program, I really wish I had this process to follow when I was doing all that previous work. And it would have made it a lot easier for me because it eliminates a lot of the thinking that you have to do about what to do next. What are the steps I need to take? And it allows me to free up my mind to be creative about how do I apply it. Right. So, and then once you have that basis, then you can start thinking about bigger organizational issues, about how to do distributed leadership, how to adapt leadership and culture, and how it works differently in different environments. So this is the stuff for people like us who spend our lives sadly thinking about all this stuff, right? But without that base level structure, we'll never get there because most people just need the structure, right? And I had this conversation with somebody just last week where the person is in the company and they're trying to put some of these higher ideas about organizational development and design and how do you make this work. But without that baseline structure that people can rely upon and understand, she's never going to get there because she's going to spend the whole time trying to drive successful examples. So I don't think the complexity is something everybody's going to care about, whether it's Cynefin or antifragile or network theory or team of teams or cell similarity and fractal organizations. These are not concepts for most people working in companies to connect with, let alone figure out how to apply. It's for the geeks like us, So the ideas need to be boiled down to clear outcomes and actions that people can take. And I think we're finally getting to that point where there are methods and approaches that are now being applied by people like you, where they can start to actually work with these higher concepts, but in a way that drives outcomes because they have these models to work with. But that's been a long time coming. And I'm going to say one more thing here because this just came to mind. We have to be nurturing in this way. There are people out there who are pushing specific ideas or specific theories, acting as O&D consultants, and they need to give room for people to explore these ideas on their own. I think there's a nasty tone out there from some people who seek to belittle people if they're not following the approach, the appropriate approach. And as a result, we don't see people coming together and sharing their success stories. And maybe they're even afraid, they become afraid to put them out in public and say, this is my idea or what I thought with. So we need to be more nurturing about allowing people to go down these roads and explore some of these concepts. But that's me preaching a little bit. So.
No, I love that. I wanted to ask because you've got so much experience in this space and you've seen so many other organizations deal with their changes and their transformations. Do you have any examples that come to mind that are like, oh, that was really cool how that was done, or that's something that I would never recommend?
That's a good question. So there are so many ways that change can fail that we often don't wait long enough to see the investment in it succeed. So it's hard to go out and say, here's a specific example where applying a change process worked and made a difference, because you would have to run it as a control group. So I did this once without change, and I did this once with change management, and the change management worked, but the other one did. You're not going to do that. So what I can say, and this is where, again, Prosci comes in really well with the research, is that it is a strong correlation towards people meeting their goals and applying excellent change management. And there's also a strong correlation of people not applying change management and not meeting their goals. So if there's a lot of examples out there where in their research where if people actually applied change management, they met their expectations, they met their goal, that project was successful in their minds and based on what they laid out as their definition of success. And there's a lot of examples of failure out there. I mean, there's also the 70-30 rule, where only 30% of change projects meet their goals. So I have seen change managed well in specific situations in a company, and then in the same company, it's not managed well. I've seen some companies that are catching on with change, but struggling with the application of it. So they're training a lot of people, but they're not actually driving it through the organization. So they're not achieving that. I see it done with strategic intent as a transformation project. And they have to approach it as a strategy within the organization itself to make it really work and permeate throughout. It goes to an idea that I think of as getting fit. If I'm going to get fit, I'm going to go out and run. The first day I'm going to go and run a kilometer. Okay. I probably won't make it very far, and I'll come home crawling. And this is from experience, come home crawling and spend the next day in pain and suffering, have to convince myself to try this again. But the more I do it, the better I get at it. and the more I can do. So that kilometer becomes the warm-up exercise, and 10 kilometers becomes something I can do on a whim. And, someday I can run 30 kilometers. Who knows, right? That's not me. I've never been able to run that far. But, same thing with lifting weights. Whatever exercise you do, you get better and better and better at it over time. And so that the first time you try it seems like now something you can do in your sleep. And if we can do that within an organization where we get better and better and better at it, we can actually handle more change and expel less energy. So to me, it's really about not just one success, but saying, look, we're going to build on that success for the next success. And we're going to allow some failures along the way and not let that subvert the fact that we're doing this change. And I'll say one other thing about it. This can be very subjective. So when we do our programs, we'll sometimes take a poll on who do you think would be a highly mature level 5, let's say, organization when it comes to change. And they'll name companies you can all name as people who you think drive change and are really good at handling change. When I have those people from those companies in the course, they'll give themselves like a 2 or a 3. They'll rate themselves as mediocre at best. Why? Because their expectations are different. So they're going to expect themselves to be much better at it than they actually are. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. It's like becoming an athlete. Once I've achieved a 10K, I have an expectation that's different of myself. So I'm going to rate myself lower than I would rate myself as somebody who's just starting out. So that's not really an answer to your question, because specific examples I think are not very useful in that conversation. I see organizations that are transformational and they're good at it all the time. Again, they're not going to necessarily think they're that great at it. So, that's what I had to say about that. So.
No, that does answer my question. By the way, I think what I gathered from that, my paraphrase of that, is that transformation is an ongoing process. It's more about health and metabolism rather than hoping to get to an end point where you can say, "Yay, success." That's sort of what I got from
Yeah, and you're never going to know, right? If I'm not going to know that I did a better job on that project than I could have done, because I'm not going to run the same project over and over again.
Yeah.
There just tends to be a trend that says people are more successful in reaching their goals if they're using change management, and there is research behind that.
So, very simple question, but I feel like it needs to be asked, David. What is change management?
Let me pull up the Prosci definition.
No, because you've said companies who are, practicing change management and companies that are not doing it. So, what is the difference?
So there's a lot of definitions of change management. So there's the Prosci one, which is it's a structured process for leading the people side of change to achieve a specific outcome. I hope I got that right, because I don't have it in front of me. But the idea is that by having a definition of it within an organization, we can all be talking the same language. But when I talk to people about it, it really varies. So when I go and give a speech on, somebody comes up to me and they say, well, we do change management because we always have a communications plan, or we always have a training plan. And then I talk to people who are on a whole nother end of it, says, well, we try to do agile at scale, and we do team of teams, and we do, all this stuff. So there's a big variation of what change management means to people. So the key is, and this is where somebody like Prosci comes in, is by having a definition, we can make sure we're talking the same language. And so there's project level change management. How do we make this project work and be adopted by the people who are impacted by that change? And then there's organizational change management, which looks at it as, leadership. Some people say a leadership competency. I say it is leadership, because if we're leaders, we're leading people to a better future, and therefore we're doing change. If we're not doing that, then we're just managing the status quo. So to me, it is leadership. And then there is another level that says it's building that capability, becoming a change capable organization so that you can have a competitive advantage in the market, or at least you're competing better than your previous self. So it becomes a
Mm-hmm.
skill. So there's a lot of what change management is. What any organization needs to do is define it for themselves and use that
Mm.
definition throughout the organization, train people on that definition. And again, that's where somebody like Prosci comes in. Yeah.
Very cool. So we like to ask this, David, of all our guests, which is, in the world that you are in, working in the spaces that you're in, if you could direct people's attention to something that's important, what would it be?
I think the theme of this conversation has been about leadership. And I think our standards for what leadership is are quite low these days. Maybe it's always been that way, and I'm getting in my 50s and I'm just becoming a grumpy old man. But I look at people I know who are leaders, and I've seen really good leaders, and I don't think we expect enough out of them. So I spend a lot of time challenging what this within both the programs I deliver and when I'm coaching leaders. I think first of all, the responsibility is on two levels. So there's what we hold as standards for leaders, and then there's what we expect of our leaders. And I don't think we're holding leaders to a high enough standards, and I don't think people are doing a good enough job seeking to become better leaders. And in a lot of ways, they're just repeating the same patterns. So our standards are based on our personal views, and are they supporting? Sometimes we're saying, are these leaders supporting us, or are they actually setting an example for everybody? Do they have a moral compass? Are they looking to seek to make the systems stronger, or are they just out for bettering them, their own situation? And those of a small group of people. I think when I look back and I study leadership in the past, the best leaders were thinking systematically. They were thinking about how do I, in my position, make a better system, a better result. It's hard to find those people anymore. And there's a cycle that happens. If we have poor leaders for whatever reason, then when people who have been experiencing that, they get into the role themselves, they repeat that behavior.
Mm.
And I
Yes.
think we're seeing that in many places around the world right now. And we should be at a point where we know better than that now.
Mm.
There's
Yeah.
enough history, there's enough study, there's enough research, there's enough experience that says we should know better how to be better leaders now, but I don't think people put their minds to it. And I really don't like seeing a cult around a particular leader.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
Quite simply, people are fallible. And so they should be focusing on the system, making the system better. Leaders that aren't focused on the system, but are on personal gain and creating this cult is really a dangerous thing now that we can see the impact of that now in many places around the world right now, where we're saying, this person, we're relying on this person. I think there's a trend towards that, which is sad right now. We're focusing on one person and one cult of leadership versus trying to make a broader system. So,
Absolutely. I agree with you.
yeah.
Good leadership matters, but I think it's also important for us to consistently revisit what that means, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has been a great conversation, David. I've gathered a lot of learning points, but in on the Salience podcast, we like to deliver 3 points of salience that came from the conversation, and I'm going to give my version of it. So I think one of the key things that came out for me is the importance of recognizing, yes, you need some kind of plan, right? You do need to think about where you want to go, what it means, but you also need to allow for things to emerge and allow for opportunities to come up. So it's not to say it's one or the other, right? It's how do we have this way of navigating between the two and balancing between the two. So one of the key points for me was the importance of balancing planned and emergent change. The other key point, which was really salient for me, was that we really need to be thinking less about, hey, did we reach a point where we can say we have succeeded, and focus more on training like all of your different transformation muscles and improving the overall health of the organization as it's sort of reaching its goal of consistently co-evolving with the environment it's in. That was really important because I think that one of the points from John Cotter, right? He said one of the 8 issues that organizations experience when they're going through change is that they declare success too early. They don't realize that it runs a lot deeper than that. And then the third point of salience I really like that I took away from this last question is the importance of leadership, right? And we've talked about in this conversation the importance of planning and leadership that sort of creates an overall framework, but also leadership that enables the rest of the system to respond, that enables the system to actually adapt to its own conditions as they're experiencing it, and also having to consistently revisit what that means, and to recognize that a good leader is not about how cool or how cult worthy they are, but really what is their impact on the system? How have they actually created some kind of more enabling impact on the system so that the system can also co-evolve with the times? So those for me were the 3 points of salience.
Well, I'm glad you repeated those because it makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about. So,
Absolutely.
with
Thank you
your
so
summary.
much for sharing. All right. Thank you, David.
All right, thanks, Jen.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.